Hello and welcome to Speed Politics 101, your go-to channel for unpacking the world of politics, society, and everything in between. I'm Billy Agwanda, and I'm thrilled to have you here as we explore the fascinating ideas that shape our societies, past, present, and future. If you're curious about how politics influences our everyday lives, hit the subscribe and notification button so you never miss an update. People seem to think world peace is impossible, whether that's because of mankind's nature, the ambitions of rulers, or the structure of states. But today, I want to introduce you to a thinker who refused to accept that inevitability. A philosopher who, from his quiet study in Königsberg, dared to ask, what if peace were not a fleeting dream, but a rational necessity? Immanuel Kant is often remembered for his dense and rigorous philosophy, for his explorations of reason, morality, and the very nature of human understanding. But beyond the abstractions, his work speaks to something deeply practical: how we ought to live, how we ought to govern, and yes, how we might even secure lasting peace. Kant believed that reason was humanity's greatest tool, that morality was not a matter of personal preference, but a duty derived from universal principles and law. However, these universal principles and laws do not just stop at the level of individual ethics. It extends to politics, to justice, and to the relationships between nations. In his famous essay titled Perpetual Peace, and which will be our central focus today, Kant lays out a radical yet logical vision, a vision of a world where republics, bound by a common legal framework, replace the chaotic competition of warring states. He argues that war is not a necessity of human existence but a failure of political structures, a failure we can correct. Now let us unpack the feasibility of this vision, which, though written in the 18th century, remains strikingly relevant today as we grapple with conflicts, fragile alliances, and the challenges of global cooperation. Our driving question is perpetual peace an achievable goal, or is it merely an idealistic dream? Before we can begin to explore the finer details of Kant's idea of perpetual peace, let us first consider the historical circumstances that influenced his thinking. In other words, why did Kant write this essay at that particular moment in history? Our focus here is redirected to Europe, a continent engulfed in major conflicts and wars. People often speak of revolutions as sudden storms, unpredictable and chaotic. But the French Revolution was not just a storm. It was an earthquake, shattering the very foundations of Europe's old order. For centuries, monarchs had ruled by divine right, nobles enjoyed privileges untouched by time, and war was the game of kings, played over dynastic disputes. Then, in 1789, France erupted. The people rose, not just against a king, but against an entire system. At the heart of this upheaval was the end of absolute monarchy. France had long been ruled by kings who claimed their power came from God himself, unquestionable and eternal. But when Louis XVI was put on trial and executed in 1793, the world gasped. A king, once the embodiment of the state, was now just a man, subject to the will of the people. This was no mere political shift, it was a message to every throne in Europe that monarchy was not untouchable. If France could overthrow its king, why couldn't others? The rulers of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia feared that revolution would spread, that their own people might one day stand against them. And the fear was justified. The revolution did not just topple a king, it also dismantled the feudal order. The centuries-old privileges of the aristocracy were stripped away, serfdom abolished, noble titles erased, and power redistributed. No longer were people subjects of a king, bound by birth to an unchangeable fate. They were now citizens, equal before the law. This idea was radical, dangerous even, and it spread like wildfire. Across Europe, in Italy, Poland, the German states, and Spain, people whispered of liberty, of throwing off the chains of the past. Monarchs and nobles saw not just a rebellion in France, but the beginning of an age that threatened their very existence. But the old order did not fall quietly. Europe's monarchies banded together, hoping to crush the revolution before it spread. War erupted in 1792, as Austria and Prussia marched against France, soon joined by Britain and others. But this was no ordinary war. France, now a republic, declared a levy en masse in 1793, a mass conscription that mobilized an entire nation for war. Gone were the days of small professional armies fighting for kings. Now entire populations were drawn into conflict, making war a struggle of peoples, not just rulers. And from this chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged. A child of the revolution, he rose through the ranks, seizing power in 1799 and crowning himself emperor in 1804. With his military genius, he tore apart the old European balance of power, defeating Austria, Prussia, and Russia, redrawing the map, and dissolving the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. But Napoleon did not just conquer, he spread the ideas of the revolution. In every land he occupied, feudalism was abolished, old aristocracies lost their privileges, and French revolutionary laws reshaped society. Even when Napoleon fell in 1815, Europe had already changed beyond recognition. The victors of Napoleon, the monarchs of Europe, gathered at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, desperate to restore the old world. Borders were redrawn, kings were reinstated, and conservative rulers vowed to suppress revolutionary ideals. But they could not erase what had been done. The revolution had planted seeds of liberalism, nationalism, and republicanism, seeds that would grow into the great upheavals of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the aftermath of the French Revolutionary Wars, treaties were signed, like the Treaty of Basel in 1795, which sought to bring a pause to conflict. But Kant saw through it. It was not peace, at least in the truest sense of peace. Rather, these treaties were merely armistices, a temporary truce until the next inevitable war. And Kant wanted more than a truce. He wanted permanent peace. But could peace truly be achieved in a world of kings and emperors, of conquest and rivalry? Kant believed it could, if humanity embraced reason, if nations abandoned their destructive habits, if states were governed not by the whims of monarchs but by the will of their citizens. Kant's Perpetual Peace is often remembered for its 3 definitive articles, or the principles that define the conditions for lasting peace. But before we get to those, Kant lays out 6 preliminary articles, rules that states must follow before the definitive articles can even take effect. These preliminary articles serve as foundational safeguards, setting the stage for a true and lasting peace, not just a temporary truce. Let's start with the first preliminary article, one that strikes at the very core of what Kant means by peace. He argues that no peace treaty should contain secret clauses that allow for future war. This is because for peace to be genuine, it must not be a mere pause in hostilities, rather, it must be a true resolution of conflict. As a result, a treaty that merely postpones war is not peace but an illusion and a delay before the inevitable return to violence. This is where Kant challenges the very nature of diplomatic agreements of his time. Kant therefore emphasizes that the underlying causes of future war, even if they are not yet visible, must be completely eliminated through the peace process itself. In his vision, peace is not about managing war, it is about preventing it altogether. So before we even get to the other definitive articles, Kant first demands that we redefine what peace actually is, because without that, everything else crumbles. At the core of Kant's vision is his second definitive article: the law of nations shall be founded on a federation of free states. Here, Kant is not proposing a world government, but rather a voluntary league of nations, where sovereign states commit to resolving disputes peacefully. Without such a structure, peace remains fragile, always at risk of collapse under the pressures of power and competition. Crucially, this federation must be voluntary simply because peace imposed by force is no peace at all. It must be chosen, institutionalized, and upheld through law rather than coercion. Kant's second definitive article foreshadows the United Nations, the European Union, and the very concept of collective security that underpins modern diplomacy. His argument is clear: war will not end by accident. It will only end when states institutionalize peace, when they replace power politics with cooperation, dialogue, and the rule of law. Kant's third definitive article identifies 3 types of power: military power, the power of alliances, and power of money. Kant is wary of the conflict-inducing capacities of money and links it explicitly with the onset of war. Take, for instance, how he boldly calls for the gradual abolition of standing armies. His reasoning is clear: as long as states maintain permanent military forces, an arms race becomes inevitable. If one state expands its army, others will feel compelled to do the same and consequently become locked in an endless cycle of escalation. There is no natural stopping point. The pursuit of military superiority has no limits. Kant recognizes this as a fundamental source of insecurity, a system that breeds war rather than preventing it. And his argument doesn't stop at military buildup. He applies the same logic to the accumulation of wealth, warning that an unchecked race for riches would trigger the same dynamic of suspicion and preemptive action. If one state amasses extraordinary resources, others will perceive it as a latent threat, a sign of possible future aggression. This, in turn, could provoke preemptive strikes or economic competition that spills over into conflict. Kant notes that in his time, such a phenomenon was mitigated by one simple fact: the difficulty of accurately measuring a state's wealth. But he seems to anticipate a future where economic power is far more visible, and therefore, far more dangerous as a tool of geopolitical competition. At its core, Kant's argument is a warning about unchecked rivalries, whether in arms or in wealth. He recognizes that as long as states are caught in a game of mutual fear and competition, peace will remain fragile. So, Kant's solution is neither an immediate disarmament, nor utopian pacifism, but a deliberate structural shift toward stability. A world where peace is not merely the absence of war, but the very condition that makes war unthinkable. Immanuel Kant's fourth preliminary article in Perpetual Peace states that a state shall not contract debts in connection with its foreign affairs. At first glance, this may appear to be a purely financial or bureaucratic concern, but in reality, it is a profound critique of how war is funded and sustained. Kant recognized that the ability of states to borrow money for military purposes creates a system in which war is perpetuated rather than constrained. This is because, by financing wars through debt rather than immediate taxation, governments are able to mask the true cost of conflict, making it easier to justify and sustain military engagements. The problem with war debt, according to Kant, is that it removes the immediate economic consequences of war from those who decide to wage it. If a government had to finance a war directly through taxation, it would likely face public resistance, as citizens would immediately feel the financial burden. However, when a state can borrow money to fund its military endeavors, the cost of war is deferred to future generations, creating the illusion that war is more affordable than it actually is. This ability to push the financial burden into the future makes it more tempting for states to engage in unnecessary conflicts, as rulers do not have to confront the immediate economic pain of their decisions. Kant's argument was shaped by the geopolitical and economic realities of his time. The great European powers of the 18th century, Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria, were engaged in a cycle of wars, many of which were financed through national debts. These conflicts were not just about defense, they were often driven by imperial ambitions, territorial expansion, and mercantilist economic policies. The ability of states to borrow money to fund military campaigns created a system in which wars became self-perpetuating, as nations fought to expand their control and resources, which in turn justified further military spending. Kant saw this as an unsustainable cycle, one that would inevitably lead to long-term economic instability and prolonged conflict. The modern relevance of Kant's argument is striking. In the 20th and 21st centuries, many of the world's largest conflicts have been financed through borrowing. The world wars left many countries in deep debt, forcing economic sacrifices long after the fighting had ended. More recently, wars such as the US-led invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were funded largely through national debt, costing trillions of dollars and contributing to economic challenges that persist to this day. Kant would argue that such conflicts might have been avoided or significantly shortened if the financial cost had been felt by the public in real time, rather than spread out over decades. Kant's alternative to debt-financed war is simple yet radical. If a state wants to go to war, it should be required to pay for it immediately through taxation rather than borrowing. This would force governments to confront the full economic reality of war from the outset, making military action a less attractive option. Citizens, when faced with the immediate financial burden of war, would be more likely to demand diplomatic solutions over armed conflict. In this sense, Kant's argument is not just about economic policy, it is about creating a system in which peace becomes the rational choice. Beyond just preventing war, Kant's fourth preliminary article envisions a broader transformation in international relations. If war is no longer economically viable, states will have greater incentives to pursue cooperation, trade, and diplomacy rather than military expansion. A world in which military power is not sustained by hidden financial mechanisms is a world where peace is not just an abstract ideal but an economic necessity. Kant presents a political framework in which states are less likely to engage in aggressive conflict, thereby laying the groundwork for perpetual peace. He insists that the civil constitution of every state shall be republican. For Kant, a republican government is not merely a representative system, it is a form of political organization characterized by three key principles: freedom of citizens, a system of laws based on equality, and a separation of powers to ensure accountability. This contrasts with absolutist or monarchical systems, where rulers often have unchecked authority and can make decisions about war without needing the consent of those who will bear its costs. Kant's central argument is that a republican form of government makes war less likely because it places the power to declare war in the hands of the people rather than an unchecked ruler. In an absolute monarchy or dictatorship, a single ruler or a small elite can decide to go to war without considering the broader public's interests. However, in a republic, war requires the consent of the citizenry, who will be the ones paying for it, suffering its consequences, and sending their sons to the battlefield. Since ordinary citizens bear the burdens of war, they are far less likely to support unnecessary or reckless military conflicts. This argument is rooted in a rational, self-interested understanding of war and peace. If those who must fight and finance a war also have the power to decide whether to engage in one, they will be naturally inclined toward diplomacy, negotiation, and peaceful resolutions. In contrast, when war is decided by an unaccountable monarch or ruling elite, personal ambitions, political calculations, or even economic incentives can drive the decision, regardless of the suffering it may cause to the general population. Kant's reasoning anticipates what modern scholars refer to as the democratic peace theory, which suggests that democracies are less likely to go to war with each other. While Kant's vision of a republican state is not identical to modern liberal democracy, the fundamental logic remains the same. Political systems that distribute power among the people and enforce legal equality create conditions in which war is a less desirable option. However, Kant does not claim that simply adopting a republican constitution will immediately ensure perpetual peace. A republic, by itself, does not guarantee that a state will always act peacefully. What matters is how republican institutions shape decision-making. A state with republican principles will have mechanisms of accountability that restrain its leaders from engaging in reckless military aggression. Yet, without an international system that encourages peaceful cooperation, even republican states can be drawn into conflict under certain conditions. Kant's emphasis on republican governance must also be understood in connection with his other principles. The republican constitution is a necessary but not sufficient condition for perpetual peace. It must be combined with his second and third definitive articles, which call for an international federation of states and universal hospitality. The second definitive article, which proposes a federation of free states, ensures that republics do not exist in isolation, but rather in a system that reinforces their peaceful inclinations. The third definitive article, which promotes the idea of universal hospitality and the right of foreigners not to be treated with hostility, ensures that republics engage with each other and with non-republics in ways that reduce the likelihood of war. Kant's philosophy remains profoundly relevant today, and the relationship between governance and peace continues to be a central concern in international relations. Studies have shown that democratic states are less likely to go to war with each other, though they may still engage in conflicts with non-democratic states. Moreover, contemporary political challenges, such as the erosion of democratic norms, the rise of authoritarianism, and the manipulation of public opinion, raise questions about how resilient Kant's vision is in practice. If the people of a republic can be misled or manipulated into supporting wars, Does that undermine the peace-promoting nature of republican governance? Despite these complexities, Kant's insight remains powerful. When political power is accountable to the people, war becomes a less attractive option.